Support for this episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlockian scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. And also by the generous support of listeners like you who choose to support us at Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Patreon.com/trifles. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the colorman was retired, the three-quarter was missing, and the client was illustrious, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever wondered why Sherlock Holmes had 3 different colored dressing gowns? Or what a Crockford is?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 335, Alcoholism. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we look into the minutiae of the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
Burt, I don't know about you, but I'm about ready for a drink.
I am ready for a nice cup of temperance green tea.
Well, you're going to be ready for something stronger after we get done with this episode.
No. You've got to turn your back on demon rum, my son, and come with me. Come with me into the clear, blue-eyed sky of clean living.
Well, I'll see what I can do to get my blue ribbon. So this is going to be an interesting episode. We have talked about alcohol before in a number of forms. We'll have links to our previous episodes that were alcohol related, including Doc Watson's medicinal brandy. But we thought we might take it from the other side when alcohol is overconsumed and when alcoholism rears its head. And there are a couple of sideways or simply trifling phrases that crop up in the canon that led us to think about this. What are they? Well, stay tuned and you'll find out if you pay attention. In the meantime, this episode is available at iHost.co/trifles335. That goes right to the SherlockHolmesPodcast.com website. And you can find all sorts of links there, including the previous episodes that we're going to mention, and some deeper reading on today's topic. You can also click on our Patreon link there, or simply just go to patreon.com/trifles to support the show. For as little as $1 a month, you can be a Trifle supporter. And later in this episode, stay tuned, all of our patrons are eligible for today's drawing. It's the end of the month, and that means we'll be giving away a back issue of the Baker Street Journal. All it takes is you need to be a patron. Again, for as little as $1 a month, your name will go into that random drawing, and we'll see whose name gets picked out. And then every quarter we also do a drawing for an annual subscription to the Baker Street Journal. So just trying to sweeten the pot there and to thank our Patreon supporters for their loyalty. Oh boy. This is kind of a sensitive topic, Bert. I mean, alcoholism, it's not something to be taken lightly. And when you think about the history of alcoholism, it really wasn't widely understood the way it is today as an actual disease. It is related to the functioning of the brain, and it wasn't until 1956 that the American Medical Association identified alcoholism as a disease. And it'll be interesting for us to explore not only where bits of alcoholism come up in the canon, but later on in the show to talk about the deeper meaning there and the history behind alcoholism and the temperance movement in Victorian and Edwardian England.
Mm. Well, it's a very good point. My memory is that it wasn't until the 1880s, far in advance of what you just mentioned for the American Medical Association, that the British formed a society for the study of not alcoholism, but inebriety, I suppose you would say, by a group of doctors and politicians. And all of this was connected to the British practice of basically regulating alcohol, licensing acts, how many pubs could be in what areas, and all of that is very interesting because it all had, I think, unlooked for impacts on that contributed to to probably a greater percentage of alcoholism than there would be without all of that management, I suppose.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a whole cultural aspect of alcohol and its role in society at the time, not the least of which was, particularly with respect to beer, is that it was healthier to drink than the water at the time because there wasn't proper sanitation. That the fermentation process actually the alcohol took out a lot of the harmful bacteria. And it was really in public. I'm going to remind my family that I drink out of public safety. That's my angle. I don't want to catch anything. So, but that is not to say, as you inferred, there were societal boogeymen associated with overconsumption of alcohol, and I think we see that early on in the canon, not only with the drunken state of Enoch Drebber at his boarding house that we see in A Study in Scarlet. And clearly Enoch Drebber was drinking to kind of settle his nerves a bit. But we see Watson's attitude toward it in the opening of A Case of Identity. This, I think, was maybe the third or fourth story in the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. And Holmes is sitting there with Watson on either side of the fire, and Watson's trying to get at Holmes's ability to read people, and Watson seems to think that it's quite obvious when he looks to a scenario in the newspaper. He says, "But here I picked up the morning paper from the ground. Let's put it to the practical test. Here's the first heading upon which I come: a husband's cruelty to his wife. There's a half column of print, but I know without reading it that it's all perfectly familiar to me. There is, of course, the other woman, the drink, the push, the blow, the bruise, the sympathetic sister or landlady. The crudest of writers couldn't invent anything more crude." And what's Holmes's response to that?
Well, Holmes's response is, he says, "Watson, you've got this all wrong. This is the real case of a dentist with very high standards who, in his own frustration about his ill-fitting dental appliance, attempts to hurl it out the window and his wife gets in the way."
Yeah, the Dundas separation case, as it happens. I was engaged in clearing up some small points in connection with it.
You'd clean up a lot, particularly with all of those dental appliances flying around the room.
Exactly. The husband was a teetotaler. There was no other woman. The conduct complained was that if he had drifted into the habit of winding up every meal by taking out his false teeth and hurling them at his wife, which you will allow is not an action likely to occur to the imagination of the average storyteller. Take a pinch of snuff, doctor, and acknowledge I have scored over you in your example. I've always loved that. But there we have the mention of drink and the exact opposite, the husband being a teetotaler, meaning that he never touched the stuff.
Well, we're dealing, of course, here in a situation where Arthur Conan Doyle had an intimate familiarity with the impact of alcoholism. And I think I've read, I don't know that this is true, but I've read that sort of as a result of that, he never took a drink, that he was teetotal. I don't know if that's really true. But basically, his father, Charles, was someone who succumbed to the evils of alcohol, was institutionalized in such an institution, later developed epilepsy. And I remember that in the 1890s, Conan Doyle's mother, Mary, wrote to, there's a letter where she wrote to the doctor who was running the asylum where her husband was a patient, and she wrote all about his delirium tremens and his attacks and the impact of all of that, and how much he carried off the family possessions in exchange for money to buy drink.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Alcoholism ends up being an affliction that doesn't only affect the individual, but affects the lives of everyone around them as well. It's a sad reality of things. We see it in, as Mary Doyle explained, but we also see it in a couple of the stories here. The Blue Carbuncle is the next up. Where does drink fall into play with respect to the Blue Carbuncle?
Oh, well, it's one of these wonderful things where, and Holmes does this, of course, other times in the Canon. There's that wonderful scene, of course, where I think it's in Sign of Four, where we have the scene about the watch. And Watson, this is Watson still getting the measure of Sherlock Holmes and still being very skeptical about his abilities, where he presents the watch. And Holmes makes a number of deductions from it, including that it belonged to his brother and that his brother took to drink. And of course, this is all accurate, and Watson is stunned. And as you mentioned in the Blue Carbuncle, it's a very similar situation where in the deductions of the hat, poor Henry Baker, his wife has ceased to love him. He's taken to drink. It's the only implication that Holmes can draw, the inference that he can draw from the wax tallow stains on the hat and other elements of a decline in shabbiness.
That's exactly right. And the way Holmes referred to it, too, he said he had foresight, but has less now than formerly, pointing to a moral retrogression, which, taken with the decline of his fortune, seems to indicate some evil influence, probably drink, at work upon him. So this notion of alcoholism being a moral retrogression and evil influence, very clearly this was being set up as not as a medical diagnosis as we know it today, but as a cultural defect, a moral defect in individuals.
Fascinating.
It really is. And there's a passing reference, and I want to get to that before we spend time on the deeper one with respect to teetotaling and blue ribbon. There's a passing reference, and you could say this is the perfectly trifling one, in the Mazarin Stone. This almost escaped me. Now, the Mazarin Stone, recall, was written by a third party, and so Watson and Holmes are spoken of in the third person. Holmes arrives, Billy shows him up, and he says, that boy's a problem, Watson. How far am I justified in allowing him to be in danger? Watson asks, danger of what, Holmes? Of sudden death. I'm expecting something this evening. Expecting what? To be murdered, Watson. No, you're joking, Holmes. Even my limited sense of humor could evolve a better joke than that. But may we be comfortable in the meantime? May we not? Is alcohol permitted? The gasogene and cigars are in the old place. Let me see you once more in the customary armchair. Now, that question that Holmes asks to Watson, is alcohol permitted? That's very curious. What do you make of it?
Well, you're right, and it completely missed me, and it's a lovely thing that you found that reference. But you need to understand the context of that moment, so this is in the beginning of the case. And we've already had this interchange between Watson and Billy. And Billy has described Holmes's behavior, his agitation, his movements. Holmes is very deeply involved in some sort of case and has been doing some semi-extraordinary things. And then Holmes emerges, and Holmes is pale and drawn. And before we get to this particular reference, we find that he hasn't eaten in days. He's very concerned about saving his energy for his brain, and so he's really diminished. And so his question is almost I look upon his question as being almost, a timorous question. Not questioning, it's not really conversational. He could be questioning himself. Is alcohol permitted? I mean, he's not in great shape, Sherlock Holmes. And in fact, one of the things that's the challenging with the entire case of the Mazarin Stone is that we have this introduction where Holmes is in fear of his life. Now, Holmes is not usually in fear of his life, but now he's expecting to be murdered. And we know in just a few short minutes, he's going to be able to defeat this great threat with the help of a phonograph.
Well, I was trying to trace the steps back to get to Holmes's attitude here. I was wondering if Watson showed up in the morning, and that's why Holmes asked, but he's not. It's 7 in the evening of a lovely summer's day. But Holmes had just woken up. Right? But Billy said, I think he's in bed and asleep. But to your point, he asked for his dinner 7:30 the day after tomorrow. So that is curious. Wondered if Holmes, if he wondered if the alcohol would have made him sufficiently unsteady that he would have scratched the record with the phonograph needle if he had been unsteady as he was getting ready to trick Count Silvius Negretto.
Well, that's possible. But, you've got this reference here. Watson had taken a step forward when the bedroom door opened and the long, thin form of Holmes emerged, his face pale and drawn, but his step and bearing active and as ever. And then, he pushes Billy out of the way. You were in danger of your life standing so close to the window, and so Holmes is not eaten, and he's, I'm a brain, Watson. The rest of me is a mere appendix. It's the brain I must consider. Well, that's a good reason why he should ask rhetorically, is alcohol permitted? And anyway, it's he could be just offering it to Watson and not himself. He says, the gasogene and cigars are in the old place. Help yourself, basically, is what he's saying.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it could have taken on an entirely different meaning if he said, I'm a brain, the rest of me is a mere liver. That would have certainly indicated his attitude to a drink. Why don't we take a little bit of a break here, and after we come back, we'll explore the final reference to alcoholism as well as the deeper implications of alcoholism in Victorian society. Stay with us. When you're looking for reference material regarding the Sherlock Holmes stories, the Baker Street Journal has been providing thoughtful articles since 1946. The topics range from the trifling to deep conundrums, but they all center around Sherlockian scholarship. And maybe you've been subscribing for years, or maybe you have yet to subscribe. But there's one resource that can make your research easier to do: the EBSJ. The EBSJ is an electronic copy of all the back issues of the Baker Street Journal from its inception in 1946 through 2011 in PDF format. That's 276 issues with more than 18,000 pages, spanning the old series to the new series, the Christmas annuals, all the way through 2011. It's entirely searchable, so you can find what you need in just seconds. Check out the EBSJ on BakerStreetIrregulars.com today. Okay, we're back talking about alcoholism. So the last reference I have was with respect to good old Jim Browner in the Cardboard Box. And remember, this was a story that originally appeared in the lineup of short stories that comprised the memoirs of Sherlock Holmes. But when it came to the book publication, it was actually held back and not published until... Was it his last bow or the case book that it was included? One of the two.
Oh, that's a very good question. I think it
was
was
in
the case book, wasn't it?
I think so. It was right before the Red Circle. So that would do it. So it was, and the reason was because, not necessarily for the alcoholism, but the violence and the adultery that was contained herein. So Jim Browner...
No, it was in his last bow.
His last bow. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Jim Browner, of course, was married to Sarah Cushing, and he had struggled with alcoholism, and he said in his police statement, I was blue ribbon at the time. And for those not familiar with blue ribbon, because it is a bit of an anachronism, this is associated with the Blue Ribbon Army. And the Blue Ribbon Army is something that cropped up in the 1880s. And it was through the gospel temperance. And it started over in America, but eventually found popularity in England. And we do have just a first page reference from the historical magazine of the Protestant Episcopal Church, volume 50, number 4, from December 1981. An article by Lillian Lewis Sheeman entitled "The Blue Ribbon Army Gospel Temperance in England." And what do we know about the background of the gospel temperance movement, Bert?
Well, it was a big success. It came to England a little bit earlier than you suggested, in the late 1870s. And it basically spread temperance teachings into all parts of the country. Many areas, particularly the rural part of England, where, there hadn't been any contact with the temperance movement, were introduced to this sort of anti-drink teachings, and it became, quite a force in society. I've looked at this brief about Lillian Lewis Shimon's commentary about all this. My memory about this, though, is that the temperance movement in England became so well established that there were temperance hotels and temperance hostels, a network of them around the country that were available to people, who were looking for so-called safe places to stay as they traveled. Now, of course, that's my memory, so my notoriously fickle memory, but it became quite a cause, and it was linked to, sort of the Salvation Army. It was linked to religion, but basically, beginning in the 17th century, if not earlier, with the gin craze and the government's attempt to limit the availability of gin, the effects on the family, on society, on the ability of people to contribute to their households, to hold work, became so obviously affected by the easy availability of alcohol that there were a number of these sorts of movements, and this took on the sense of a salvation, hence the idea of calling it gospel temperance.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And how interesting that there would be alternative locations. It's almost like a non-smoking section or a non-smoking establishment for some people, looking to avoid the temptation of drink.
Yes, yeah.
You know?
Well, it's really interesting too from a social, political, and regulatory state, because there's an argument the basic argument too to be made about all of that is that in its attempt to restrict the availability of alcohol and the number of pubs that could be within a certain geographic area, or how many pubs were available in a certain amount of territory, licensing rules, the idea that you had to shut down at certain times, all of this. The result of that became a political and economic force in the form of the people who produced alcohol and who operated pubs. And therefore, and in the same way, the Salvation Army, who had these institutions that insisted on abstinence for its members, but they were not an organization that supported prohibition because the last thing they wanted to do was to accelerate conflict with the powerful political and economic forces that were involved in the production and distribution of alcohol in society at the time.
Yeah, that's right. And there's another reference we have here. We actually have a PDF of the entire book. We're going to just pull some comments or some snips from the conclusion chapter. But the book is Drinking in Victorian and Edwardian Britain, Beyond the Spectre of the Drunkard. A fascinating title.
Always a favorite. I love to read that before I go to sleep.
I find that with a nice nightcap, it just puts me right out. This is by Thora Hans, and the link is found on the National Library of Medicine website. Again, we'll have a link in the show notes for that. But this idea that drunkenness occurred, obviously very common. They said that was only one of the many outcomes or reasons that consumers had for drinking. The desire for intoxication, the multitude of ways to seek intoxication, and the range of intoxicated behavior was infinitely more complex because it was deeply entangled within the social and cultural context in which alcohol was produced and consumed. But the Victorians were concerned with the motives of alcohol consumers. There were questions about alcohol consumption that drove parliamentary inquiries, shaped the commercial practices of the producers of alcohol, and sparked debates within the medical profession. So there's a whole idea that it was more than just a working class thing. It was both genders were affected by it, and really interesting. I think the third to the last paragraph here really nails it. The Victorians and Edwardians drank for pleasure, but they also drank for pain. And we're talking about both physical pain and mental pain. You think about, as we opened with Enoch Drebber there, drinking because he was a little anxious about Jefferson Hope being on his trail. You think about Henry Baker and him drinking because his fortunes began to turn, or his wife ceased to love him, and maybe his wife ceased to love him because he was drinking. Complex things. There was one thing we didn't mention, Bert. I don't want to interrupt you, so you go ahead with that thought.
No, I didn't have any big thought, other than agreement. This is, just in looking at this particular topic, one of the things that comes out is that this is so connected into the evolving nature of communities. In the 17th century in England, there was also coffee houses played a huge role. You would go to the coffee house. Coffee was something new. That's where you read newspapers. You met your friends. And in the same way, pub culture in Britain, even to this day, the pubs are enormously important in local communities. And even when and it's something that never established itself, I don't think, in the same way. Of course, there are taverns in the United States, but not really in the same way. And in just looking around, I noticed that actually I was wrong about licensing. Licensing in Britain and regulating alcohol went back to the 15th century. But here, in the cases of Sherlock Holmes, you've got Holmes, who deals at one point with his own taking of a 7% solution of cocaine, never had, apparently, any sort of compelling connection to alcohol, although he did appreciate wines, cobwebby bottles, and so on. You have the literary agent, Arthur Conan Doyle, who had a personal experience of that with his family. He, as I said before, I think was a teetotaler. And then in all the literature, you've got Dickens, you've got George Gissing, all writing about alcohol and alcoholism in different ways, about the degradation and cruelty, about how the weak and defenseless suffer from excessive drinking. And all of that is just another indication of how valuable the cases of Sherlock Holmes are, because they provide such a window into society when you see people like Henry Baker, and Watson's unfortunate brother.
Yeah, that's a great observation. Really great observation. Well, we have one more trifling reference to alcohol in the canon, and let's just pause here for a moment and handle our business with respect to our drawing, and then we will reveal that trifling reference. So as we say, all of our patrons, if you go to patreon.com/trifles, all of our patrons are eligible for this drawing, so we'll pull out the big prize wheel and give it a spin. This is really just a fancy random number generator. But we come up with number 62, and that looks like it is Lynn Walker. Congratulations, Lynn. We will be sending you a back issue of the Baker Street Journal. And again, if you'd like to be like Lynn and win, just go to patreon.com/trifles or just hit the link in our show notes. So the final trifling reference to alcohol. This was one I stumbled upon. I was doing some research for I think the Holmes's view on the afterlife, and I was looking up various terms, and I searched the term crypt, and that brought me to Shoscombe Old Place. And recall in Shoscombe Old Place that Sir Robert Norberton was in a precarious situation. He needed to basically ensure that he won a race, and that all of his affairs were in order. But at the same time, unbeknownst to us, his sister was suffering medically, suffering so badly, in fact, that she died. But he didn't want to give away the game. He impersonated her, and kept up affairs for the couple of weeks before the running of the horses, because it was a family-owned stable, I believe, and he wasn't sure of the ownership had her death come to light. So he gave away her spaniel, and what they were talking with, was it Mr. Mason from the Watson and Holmes were talking with Mr. Mason from the
Yeah, it's another Mason, not White Mason, not Perry,
White Mason. And he said, he gave it away to old Barnes, who keeps the Green Dragon 3 miles off at Crendel. Of course, with her weak heart and dropsy, one couldn't expect that she could get about with him, but he spent 2 hours every evening in her room. He might as well do what he could, for she's been a rare good friend to him. But that's all over, too. He never goes near her, and she takes it to heart. She's brooding and sulky and drinking, Mr. Holmes, drinking like a fish. Did she drink before this estrangement? Well, she took her glass, but now it's often a whole bottle of an evening. So Stevens, the butler, told me. It's all changed, Mr. Holmes, and there's something damned rotten about it. So they're accusing Lady Beatrice in her declining years of becoming an alcoholic. Drinking like a fish.
Yes, well, It's interesting, that Holmes, he frequently demonstrates his inability to sympathize with the emotional states of many of the people that he comes in contact with. And of course, after hearing all of this, Holmes rubs his hands. Go on, Mr. Mason. You get more and more interesting.
Well, I mean, it's certainly not the level of pulling his false teeth out and hurling them at his wife type of interesting. And maybe it's just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
And then, then I broke my blue ribbon and began drinking again. So Mary had some reason to be disgusted with me now.